In this video, we're going to continue to look at the operations function within a business by looking at exactly what a supply chain is and focusing specifically on what we mean by procurement and logistics. These are terms that you may hear thrown around. They sound businessy, and you can be tempted to say things like, they should sort out their procurement and logistics. It sounds kind of fancy, but they are both actually really important concepts that you need to understand. Let's start with some important new key terms before we get into the details. Suppliers. Well, these are other businesses who supply goods or services that are needed for a given business to function. A supply chain is the sequence of processes required for production and distribution of a good or service to the end customer, the person who's actually buying it. And then there's procurement. This is the management of purchasing within a business, sourcing all of the required supplies and services that are needed from the suppliers. And finally, there's logistics. This is the management of the transportation and storage of goods, how they get to where they need to be. Take Argos as an example. Their logistics involves making sure products arrive at the different branches when they are needed in order for them to be sold, or in many cases collected by customers who have reserved the item online. To all the teachers out there, show all of these videos without any ads and gain access to our growing library of over 500 teaching worksheets. Why not visit BizzWizard.co.uk to find out more? You really need to understand that the supply chain is pretty important. It's the organisation of people and resources that brings goods and services to the customer. For some businesses, the supply chain might be very short. For example, a village greengrocer store that sells only fruit and vegetables grown at a local farm. In this case, the supply chain is pretty simple. Local farm, village greengrocer store, customer. In other industries, the supply chain will be much longer and much more complicated. For example, a fashion retailer like Primark may source clothes from a number of overseas suppliers. These suppliers in turn source the fabric, threads, buttons, zips from their own suppliers from all kinds of places. The supply chain in this case is likely to include people, companies and resources across a number of different countries. All of this is possible because of globalization, which we'll look at in other videos. When choosing suppliers, the length of the supply chain may be a consideration. In general, a shorter supply chain may be much easier to manage, because you want to minimize the number of links in the chain in an effort to avoid problems occurring. If one link breaks, this can mean the whole chain is broken. Fundamental to a successful supply chain is procurement. As I've mentioned, this is the process of selecting a supplier, agreeing payment terms, and even in some cases contract details. In the example above of a local farm supplying a greengrocer's store, once the owner of the store has selected the farm he wants to choose as his supplier, the store owner and the farmer will usually sign a contract detailing the agreement they have made. This contract could be thought of as a written promise from both parties on how they will work together, including things like payment terms. You know how many days after the produce has been sent to the greengrocer store will the invoice need to be paid. It's often 14 or 30 days. I'm not really sure why it is, but in some cases it can be much longer. In a more complicated situation than this farm, like in our previous example where a major fashion retailer is sourcing clothing, they may or may not own the factory where the goods are made. If they don't own a factory, then the procurement team will need to look around for suppliers that meet their requirements. Find these suppliers and put contracts in place explaining the terms that they will need to work to. One of these suppliers is likely to be a clothing manufacturer operating a clothing factory. This factory will usually have a procurement team who source the materials needed for clothing manufacture and put arrangements in place with their own suppliers to get the necessary resources, and so on and so on and so on. Some supply chains will have many links in the chain, and often if one link breaks, for example a supplier of wood stops trading, this can have significant implications for every business that uses that wood. Bring this video and over 100 more to life with fun, interactive games, quizzes and case studies. Why not try the first 25 completely free by visiting BizzWizard.co.uk. Logistics is actually the process of getting goods or services to where they need to be. In most cases, the logistics team will work closely with the procurement team. They are concerned with the process of getting products from A to B. So, for example, getting products from a manufacturer to a warehouse, or from a warehouse to the shop. In this video, we're going to meet Joe Goldblum. As you might guess from his appearance, Joe is a farmer, and he runs his family farm, Goldblums. Goldblums specialise in growing organic apples on their Somerset farm, using the same traditional farming and harvesting methods that Joe's great-grandfather used over 100 years ago. Most of their apple harvest is supplied to the Super Scrumpy Company, a major cider manufacturer based 50 miles away in Devon. Goldblums' farm has been supplying apples to the Super Scrumpy Company for the last 5 years. They use a carefully selected blend of apples from a number of different farms all across the southwest of England to make their award-winning cider. It's really important to them that the apples supplied are of the highest possible quality to make their unique tasting cider, which is sold in pubs, restaurants, gift shops and on their own website. Joe was contacted by Fiona, the head of procurement at the Super Scrumpy Company, after she had seen Goldblums featured on Farming Today, a local TV programme. The programme about Goldblums' farm featured Joe talking about the traditional methods that they use and their commitment to being 100% organic. Fiona was impressed and she asked Joe if she could come and meet him at the farm to discuss the possibility of working together. Fiona had a lot of questions for Joe, including how much fruit could they supply each harvest, what price would be charged per kilo of fruit, and stuff like this. Once they had agreed these figures, they then had to agree on the payment terms. How long would it take for the Super Scrumpy Company to pay Goldblums after each delivery? They agreed that the invoices from Goldblums would be paid 60 days after they were sent to the Super Scrumpy Company. Fiona arranged to draw up a contract that both she and Joe signed on behalf of both of their companies. Joe asked Fiona how the apples would be transported from his farm to the Super Scrumpy Company in Devon. Fiona agreed to put Joe in touch with Gary, the logistics manager, to make the necessary arrangements. Gary calls Joe to talk about the logistics of getting the apples from Goldblum's farm to the factory in Devon. It's actually more complicated than you might think. Gary's preferred delivery company is called Fruity Logistics. They are experts in handling deliveries of fruit and vegetables, and their refrigerated lorries are always kept immaculately clean. Fruity Logistics will provide Goldblums with a number of reusable apple trays which can be stacked efficiently in the lorries. Once the apples have reached the Super Scrumpy factory and have been turned into cider, the process doesn't stop there. The cider is then sent into tanker lorries to the bottling plant where it is bottled and labelled, ready to be sent to the next stage of the supply chain. The pubs, restaurants, gift shops who will get the cider to the consumer. At each stage of the supply chain, the procurement and the logistics teams will need to make the necessary contracts and payment arrangements, as well as arranging for the goods to be moved from one location in the supply chain to the next. Each of the video courses over at BizzWizard.co.uk also includes an interactive business case study that applies the knowledge learnt to a real-world scenario. There are over 1,000 multiple-choice questions, each with detailed feedback, which tests students' understanding of the content. Why not visit BizzWizard.co.uk to find out more? As we've seen, the procurement and logistics teams at the Super Scrumpy Company have a lot of responsibilities, and they deal with a large number of suppliers too. This is why they are a really good example of just how important these processes are. In a smaller organisation, such as Goldblums Farm, we've seen that Joe takes most of the responsibility for dealing with procurement and logistics himself. Whereas in a much larger organisation, such as the Super Scrumpy Company, these teams are incredibly important and can play a vital role in the company achieving success. It will always depend on the particular business you are looking at and the industry that they operate in. Let's have a look at just some of the specific advantages of having a procurement and/or a logistics team within a business. Firstly, they will ensure that the business has the correct ingredients, materials, or components needed to produce its product or service. They will also make sure that these items are available at the right time, in the right place, and at the right quantity. This should mean less waste, which will keep costs down. In addition, it should also result in production being able to flow continuously, which will mean better availability and hopefully more sales. In other words, taking the time to plan and implement procurement and logistics properly will lead to greater efficiency. And the greater the efficiency means lower costs, which may be passed on as lower prices to the customer, and if the demand is elastic, this could result in higher sales. However, the reason that it is generally only larger organisations that have dedicated logistics and procurement staff is because it can be very expensive to have specific teams to manage these processes. Do remember though, often in a larger business, the efficiencies and savings that these teams can create make it more than worthwhile actually having them in place. Think about Amazon. If they didn't have these teams in place, their operations would be almost impossible. If you get a question about the supply chain, remember to think through all of the possible stages, from the suppliers of the raw materials, right through to the process of getting the finished goods or service to the end customer. As we've seen, some supply chains can be very short and straightforward, and others are far more complex. Every business will need to deal with these important functions. If you need to buy stuff, then you will have to procure it. And if you need to move that stuff around, then you are your own little logistics team. Regardless of the size of your business, these processes are extremely important, and getting them right can lead to improved efficiency, which can often lead to an improved ability to defeat your competition and hopefully increase your market share. This has been the BizzWizard. See you